I didn't know Nancy that well. I was with her at a few events, and I traveled with her to Haiti once. But what I can say about her was that is that she was an extraordinary woman of compassion, a woman of virtue, and a woman of faith. And I am happy to lead us in prayer in this service in memory of a life well lived. So let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we praise and bless you for your goodness and the love that you have for all your children, but especially for your compassionate concern for the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed. Give us the grace to be your loving presence for these, our brothers and sisters. Faithful God, we humbly ask your mercy for your servant Nancy, who worked so generously to build your kingdom of peace and justice. Grant her the reward of her labors and bring her safely to your promised land. Father of mercies and God of all consolation, you pursue us with untiring love and dispel the shadow of death with the bright dawn of life. Be our refuge and our strength, and lift us from the depth of grief into the peace and light of your presence. Enable us, therefore, to press on toward you, so that after our earthly course is run, you may reunite us with Nancy and those we love who have gone before us. Be with us now, O Lord, as we gather to celebrate her life. Amen.
Amen.
And now I'm happy to introduce Jenny Block, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Father Jorge, and for being with us. Nancy was an extraordinary woman, and her life was marked by deep and meaningful connections to a very wide variety of people and institutions. And our speakers today represent some of those connections, and I'm honored to be able to introduce you to the people who will offer reflections on the life and legacy of Nancy Dorsinville. Our first speaker is Kerry Kennedy, president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. Kerry was a close friend of Nancy's, and together they shared an abiding passion and commitment to human rights and a more just and peaceful world. Kerry?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and sharing this moment. The last time I heard from Nancy was Easter Sunday, and she signed her greeting to me with the words of her great patron saint, words that sum up Nancy's entire being. They are, quote, in everything to love and to serve. Nancy grew up in Haiti and received full scholarships to Choate, Columbia, and Harvard School of Public Health. She was brilliant. But more than brilliant, she had an extraordinary emotional intelligence, which drew people to her and made her a deeply trusted friend, an extraordinary anthropologist, and an able advocate with the highest levels at the UN, the Clinton Foundation, and beyond. But those two gifts, as abundant as they were, paled in comparison with her greatest gift of all, the gift of the Spirit. No doubt that's why Nancy collected godchildren by the armload. I'm proud to say my daughter, Michaela, is one of the chosen. Recognizing her gifts, the Archdiocese of New York designated Nancy a consecrated virgin. sort of a nun outside of a particular order who devotes her life to the love of Christ in chastity, poverty, and obedience. In 2015, Nancy joined an RFK human rights delegation to Santo Domingo to look at the treatment of Dominicans of Haitian descent. Nancy explained that Dominicans of Haitian descent there are virtually denied birth certificates to establish their legal identity. Deprived of birth certificates, they are then denied school, access to healthcare, the franchise, a passport, or the right to work. Those few who do obtain the coveted certificate can expect to have it confiscated and arbitrarily declared null and void by government agents. Without papers, hapless victims are often turned over to the police and military. And without proper identification papers, the Dominican citizen, based on nothing more than the color of her skin, might then face one of the massive expulsions to Haiti, where she has no ties, no family, does not speak the language, and where no one in her family has visited for 4 generations. The military has performed barbaric acts during those sweeps, including raping women, separating families, and stealing the little property owned by those being expelled. We drove to encampments in Pedernales, just across the Dominican border inside Haiti, where as many as 15,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent had been dumped by the Dominican army in the few weeks prior. I've never witnessed such dire poverty. No running water, no electricity, a few scattered johns, nearly all of them broken for 15,000 people. No organization at all. The tents were made of collected garbage, mostly cardboard and tattered clothes hung together with a few sticks. Nancy led the way into a tent crafted by magazines and blue jeans. We found a woman there in agonizing pain, 9 months pregnant, alone, having contractions, clearly in extraordinary distress. Nancy went to overdrive, telling one of us to get the car, another to call the hospital, a third and fourth to carry the woman outside. Nancy then climbed into the seat next to her, soothing her on her ride to the ER, where she had an emergency C-section. There is no doubt in my mind that that mother and that infant would have died without Nancy's intervention and advocacy. That was classic Nancy. She advocated powerfully for sweeping policy reform, but she was more about the actual mothers and fathers, the sisters and brothers on the ground. Her heart was always with people. I love talking to Nancy about Haiti, about public health, and about women's rights. But most of all, I love talking with Nancy about the Jesuits. She took me to her favorite church in Port-au-Prince, and we read Mass together, riding buses around the DR and Haiti. We met for confession on Ash Wednesday at St. Patrick's and for Easter Mass at St. Ignatius Loyola at 84th and Park. I will never forget her compassion. And I know she will always be a presence in my life, a presence of faith, a presence of hope, urging us onward to love and to serve. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think everything people are going to say today resonates with our own experiences with Nancy. Our next speaker, Bill Horan, has many titles and accomplishments in his long and successful career working on behalf of some of the poorest people in the world. But I would venture to say one of the accomplishments and titles he holds most dear is co-founder of Zombie Beni, along with Nancy and Loune and Paul in post-earthquake Haiti, where he is affectionately known as Papa Bill.
Thank you, Jenny. I met Nancy the first time on my second trip to Haiti in 2009. I'd never been to Haiti, and I met Paul Farmer at a global health forum in Norfolk, Virginia. And about 2 minutes after I met him, he asked me, as only Paul can ask, why aren't you working in Haiti? And frankly, I didn't have any really good answers. And I said, well, we don't speak the language. You don't have friends there. He said, wait a minute, you've got friends there. He pointed to himself. And that was the beginning of my experiences in Haiti that led to my meeting of Nancy on my second trip. When I went to Haiti the first time, Loune, I asked her if I could only do one thing in Haiti, what would it be? And she said, we need running water at our hospital in Belladere. So that was our target on the first project, and took us about 4 or 5 weeks to do that. And after we finished, I went back to Haiti. And on that trip, Loune, we spent a lot of time in the car going to and from other hospitals that Partners in Health, Zami Lasante, was managing. And but before we left, she said, a friend of mine is on the island, and she's going with us. Her name's Nancy Dorsinville. And we picked up Nancy, and so we spent a couple of days together, and that's how I got to know her. I was astonished by Nancy from the very first time I met her. She's just, the enormity of her intellect and her ability to be able to explain such complex situations, humanitarian situations that are difficult to explain. And she would not only explain why they happen, why they're continuing to happen, but she'd make very wise comments about what she thought should happen. I was just absolutely blown away by her. And from then on, we were friends. In December of that year, in her capacity working with President Bill Clinton as special envoy to Haiti, she called me one day and she said, Bill, can you come down to Haiti next week? And I said, well, sure, what's going on? And she said, well, I'd like to talk to you about doing a project for President Clinton, and it would involve safe water at our large hospitals. And at that time, we didn't really have many resources in the country, but I said, well, I'll certainly have a look with you and see what we can do to help. And so she took me to General Hospital in Port-au-Prince, is where she wanted to start, and met with Dr. Alex Loseg, the administrator there. And after introductions, and I told him that Nancy had asked me to come by to take a look at their water situation. He said, well, the water situation's bad, but I'd rather talk to you about something else first, and that's our sewage situation. And he told me about raw sewage bubbling up in his operating rooms. I never had heard of such a horrible thing. And it was in the process of trying to analyze that project in anticipation of President Clinton's visit, which had not been announced, but it was going to happen in January. And we wanted to be able to use that as the first project. And we were actually working on it on that terrible day when the world ended for many with the terrible earthquake. Nancy and Loune, who were such a dynamic pair, both had a deep compassion specifically for the children that had been abandoned, either because they were orphans or maybe their parents didn't know how to deal with their disabilities. And there were about 47 of them living in 2 rooms there at the General Hospital. And Loune and Nancy were advocates for those children and helped them out the best they could. But then when the earthquake happened, Dr. Loseg got a hold of Loune and asked her if she could please come and pick up the children. They weren't hurt in the earthquake. Their building wasn't damaged, but they just lacked the resources to take care of them. And somehow Nancy and Loune were able to arrange transportation. First of all, made an agreement with Father Rick Frechette at his facility to temporarily house them, with the agreement that Loune and Nancy were going to look after them and provide all the funding for their food, their care, et cetera. And that's really where Zami Beni really started, but it didn't have a name yet. So Loune had called me on the phone one day and asked if Operation Blessing was able to participate if they found the right facility. And I told her, certainly we would and would look forward to that. My own sister was born with Down syndrome, so I have a special soft spot in my heart for children born with disabilities. But anyway, After a couple of months, they found the property where Zami Beni is now located. And we were able to help fund that purchase of the property and get very much involved in rebuilding the roofs or fixing, just doing the kind of hard work around there that needed to be done. And our team on the ground was happy to do it. But before we actually formally did any of that, once the property was secured, we had to have a name for the organization. And we met at our headquarters near the US Embassy. And we're talking about, what are we going to name this? And Nancy came up with the name. She said, well, why don't we use half of your name, Blessing, and half of our name, Zami, and it's Blessed Friends. And it was such a perfect, wonderful name and such a reflection of just her extraordinary brilliance. This morning I was reading through dozens of emails that I received over the years since then from Nancy, and I was both saddened and joyful in reading the eloquent words that she would write in those emails. I mean, I'm writing a book right now about my experiences, and there's going to be a chapter in it about Nancy Dorsinville. So I thank the people that put this event together, and God bless you all, and God bless our friend Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm very happy to introduce my good friend, Reverend Allie Lutz. Allie's an Episcopal priest and a theologian, and she teaches at Church Divinity School of the Pacific. But before Allie's time in theological studies and ministerial training, she worked for many years for Partners in Health in Haiti. And she counts Nancy as a very important influence and mentor. Allie?
Thank you, Jenny. I don't have the words to say how honored I feel to be asked to share about the tremendous spirit that is Nancy and the mentor she was to me. So let me begin with a word from Christian scriptures. John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through it, and without it, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in the Word was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Nancy taught me that a true word is active. A true word creates. A true word brings into being life, which is love and justice among all people. A true word of life leaves eternal traces. Nothing can overcome it, not even death. Nancy knew and taught me the difference between the eternal word of life and temporary speech making that prolongs a death-dealing order. Nancy brought the life-giving word everywhere she went, into bureaucratic centers of power. Before I met Nancy, I had heard the story about her reaching across a conference table to tell a transnational bureaucrat, while you are thinking, my people are dying. Nancy lived the eternal word of life. She shared it with me over dinner at a Haitian restaurant in New York, at my ordination at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, when I witnessed her teaching at the Mirbelet University Hospital, on the phone when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life to be of service. And she shared this eternal word of life with me by touching to my heart the glowing flame for love and justice that burned in her heart. It radiated through my mind, body, and spirit. It connected me to life that is the light of all people. Nancy drew me into a solidarity, not of the socially powerful bending down to help the dispossessed, nor of an educated teacher bestowing knowledge on students who lack it. Nancy accompanied me into solidarity that begins with the light of the people who struggle to live in a world set up to destroy them and their dignity. The people who shine their light to help each other make a way through. This, Nancy taught me, is the word of life that will light our way home to love and justice. And it must pass through each heart. Nancy shined on me the light of love, as I know she did on each of you, and it felt like standing in a soft sunbeam. But don't let that tenderness fool you. It will change your life forever. Nancy's light of love helped me find my way home to my vocation as a teacher and a priest. I learned how to teach mission and values from Nancy, who incorporated wisdom, compassion, gentleness, and strength, all in equal measure, to nurture, protect, and let shine the light of all people. Nancy was a bearer of the word of life, which was in the beginning with God. And Nancy remains in the heart of God with the eternally life-giving word. And one day she will welcome us all home again. Amen.
Allie, thank you so much. I'm very honored to introduce the esteemed novelist and friend of so many of us, Edwidge Danticat, a longtime friend of Nancy's, who will offer a reflection and read an excerpt from Nancy's chapter in Haiti after the earthquake.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everyone, for being here to honor Nancy. I first met Nancy over 30 years ago, and I had to really go back and figure out like the exact moment when I was a student at Barnard College, where she had graduated from in 1981. A dean she was very close to, Dean Barbara Schmitter, introduced us at one of the school gatherings. From that moment on, she always called me Samwe, her sister. Whenever she could, she would always came to whatever I was doing and would always have an encouraging word and buy lots of books for friends and family at the end. The last time we spoke was on March 9th of this year. She had just watched a program I had done virtually and called to say how much she had enjoyed it. I had no idea that this was the last time we would speak to one another. Over the years when we talked, I would ask Nancy about a book she had once mentioned that she wanted to write about Haiti. Whenever I brought it up, though, she would giggle and quickly change the subject. A few years ago, after the January 12, 2010 earthquake in Haiti, she wrote an essay for an anthology called After the Earthquake, edited by Paul. Here's a short excerpt from that essay. It's called Goudou Goudou. Haitians have a profoundly extensive tradition of venerating the dead. And the days immediately following the catastrophe, many survivors could not locate their loved ones. People had been buried alive in their homes or places of work. The main morgue at the General Hospital was not working, and the morgues that are normally attached to funeral parlors were, for the most part, destroyed. In some neighborhoods, people sat in front of their destroyed homes with their dead neatly wrapped for the most part in pristine white sheets by their side. They sat there as if waiting for something big to happen, even though the big event had already occurred. A Haitian doesn't just say, I went looking for my neighbor and knocked on his door. Instead, she mimics the sound of the action and says, Dans la caille voisine, et vient te frapper sur porte la Coco. I went looking for my neighbor and knocked on his door. Coco. The folk art of effective storytelling in Haiti has one cardinal rule. The sound brings life to the story. If there's an accident on the road, a masterful narrator will not simply explain what occurred, but will depict it in a culturally prescribed manner. The cobalt blue 2008 Toyota was approaching at full speed, vroom, when the red and yellow colored tap-tap abruptly made the curve, phew, and they collided, boom. For the storyteller and her audience, sounds impart the nuanced details of the moment and not only enliven the account, but render the story credible. Creole is not a tonal language, but it is hugely phonetic. Words don't stand alone, but are reinforced by sound. Creole appropriates and conveys sounds in a powerfully onomatopoeic way. When the earthquake occurred, Haitians used the descriptive term to convey what it was, tremblement de terre or earthquake. In the early days, they also called the earthquake bagayla, that thing. This vague amorphous term struck me because it underscored that what had happened had no name and was so outside what we considered livable or bearable that it could not be named. Yet people had ascribed this unnameable thing, bagayla, anthropomorphic qualities. It had killed their loved ones, demolished their homes, and often their businesses. It had to be named. And for the healing to begin, the name had to echo what shook our very core in those 35 infernal seconds. Creole is the language of our glory, the language of our fury, a vehicle to codify both our resistance and resilience. As we began to awaken, the name for bagayla was coined. A neologism was created in accordance to Haitian norms and tradition, using the onomatopoeia gudu gudu. The disastrous event had been named. We, the people, were somehow on our own terms regaining our bearings after the catastrophe. The first time I heard someone say gudu gudu, I shuddered, but then I sighed. I understood. For me, as a Haitian, this was the first step on terra firma. Merci, Nancy.
Oh, Edwidge, thank you so much. One of Nancy's greatest joys was mentoring students. And for many years, each week she took the train from New York to Boston. She often called me on the ride from New York down to Boston. And she loved to serve as both a mentor and a role model for global health students. One of her former students, Luke Messac, now a physician finishing his residency at Brown University, will share his reflection on Nancy in the classroom.
Thanks so
Dr.
much.
Messac, that's what I call you now.
Please. Thank you so much for bringing us together to remember Nancy. Although, can you imagine the fear that gripped my heart after seeing my name on the program after Edwidge Danticat? So some sympathy for me too, please. I met Nancy when I was 18. I was a freshman in college. What I remember about those years was that so much of life seemed like people striving, people seeking a way up. There's a lot of ambition. And Nancy was always happy to help with that. You know, she would write my recommendation letters. She would edit my papers. She would take my naive ideas and mold them into something approaching usefulness. But she herself never seemed to be striving for any personal glory. She was always inviting me to something. She was inviting me to meetings. She was inviting me to dinner. She was inviting me to mass. She was inviting me to fellowship. In an environment so marked by ambition and at times isolation, she'd meet anytime. When some of my friends and I, some of them might be on this right now, we asked her if she could meet with us to plan out a campaign, kind of a subversive campaign we had to get Harvard to take less overhead on a grant that was meant to fund AIDS treatment in Africa. She had booked herself solid the whole day. She was working all day, she was working all evening. So she sent us an email saying, how about we meet at the population center at 11 p.m. That was, nothing was too burdensome for her as much as we would ask her. In the midst of those cold, dark Cambridge winters, she was there, inviting us to come together, to be together, to eat, to laugh, to plan, to plot. And yes, more than once, we met as we meet today to grieve. She wasn't afraid to share her grief. When some fresh indignity or unimaginable disaster would befall Haiti, she wouldn't hide it. In this, she reminded me of my Haitian aunts and my Haitian grandmother. My dad has 6 sisters, so I felt like she was one of them. They knew what I've struggled to learn, that grief does not forbid smiles and it doesn't forestall good work, but it is an unavoidable part of our short lives on this beautiful yet broken world. She was gentle, she was kind, but Nancy didn't skip that second step in Catholic social teaching, the directive to see, judge, act. When she sought to pragmatically ease the suffering she saw all about her, what she saw often made her angry. When we met on a hillside in Ringwavu, Rwanda, one of my first times out there as a very young man, I said something trite about how punishing it was to be poor after what I'd seen. And she said, they're not just poor, Luke. They've been impoverished. She pushed me to think about the historical structures and agents of that impoverishment. Her encouragement spurred me to pursue a doctorate in African colonial history alongside my medical degree. So I owe her so much. She lives with me still in all that I do and all that I hope, and I'll miss her. I hope she knew how much she meant to me and to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luke. I know you speak for many, many students through Nancy's long career mentoring students. Our next speaker is the noted documentary filmmaker and social activist, Abby Disney. And Nancy was a very close friend of Abby and her family for many years. And we're so glad you're here with us today.
Thank you, Jenny. I have to say thank you, all of you, for everything that you've said. I feel that a great memorial conjures that person. It's a little like a seance. And I can feel Nancy's presence here and all the love and respect that people had for her. I wrote something I hate reading from writing, but she's too important to me to be stupid about. So I'm going to do something she would axe murder me for if she were here. I'm going to talk about sainthood. I grew up in the Catholic tradition. And when I was little, I read about the saints the way other kids read comic books. My favorite stories were the messy ones, the people who worked themselves to death or got self-immolated or got tortured by terrible bad guys. And yes, to answer the question that just popped into all of your heads, I was a weird little girl. Other faith traditions don't understand what a Catholic is talking about when they talk about the saints. They think of these pasty, mushy stories from the Hallmark Channel or telegenic miracle making and children getting carried across rivers and so forth. But when a Catholic is talking about sainthood, they have something very different in mind. They're talking about blood and guts and tears and sweat and agon and telos and pathos and agape. They're talking about taking by far the longest and roughest road to heaven. They're talking about making their bodies into offerings, turning their spirits into apotheotic submissions, giving their minds and hearts over to their fellow human beings and to God. I know you all know I'm talking about Nancy when I talk about saints, because many people, when they talked about her, used that word for her, and she hated it. She'd be furious at me for using the word. And that's partly because saints don't like to be called saints. But it was more because when people call other people saints, they're usually referring to that Hallmark version and not the gritty embodied verb that Nancy was determined to be. I met Nancy at my first Women's Foundation meeting, New York Women's Foundation, in 1992. She and I were both the new recruits at that meeting. So we got paired together a lot and we got on this fast track to friendship. And since I knew nothing and she knew everything, she was kind of a perfect mentor to me. She was warm and generous and she loved a good laugh. And so soon she was gracing our Thanksgiving table, showing up for first communions and so many special moments. And when my third child was born, I could think of no better person to be his godmother than Nancy. Nancy could teach you a lot, and she did help me learn a lot that I did not know. But more than that, what she taught me was just in and who she was. Such a description invokes that Hallmark thing again. But I saw her temper from time to time, and you didn't want to get on the wrong side of that, Nancy. No, the who she was that taught me so much was in her patient and loving, but nevertheless dogged and uncompromising drive to be kindness, to be generosity, to be loving solidarity with the poor and the powerless. In my life, and I am not exaggerating, I have never, ever met, nor do I think I shall meet again, a person who more tenaciously put their body and heart and being into the work that true loving solidarity asks of us all. She barely slept. From time to time, I would yell at her. Once I demanded she come over so I could feed her and stand guard at her door so that she would just sleep. Nevertheless, over the years, I could see the physical toll this loving solidarity was taking on her. Always she soldiered, or I guess sainted on. I always knew I could go to her when I needed advice or support. She was never too tired. She humbled me over and over again, all while making me feel like I was, after all, a good person. And I don't know how she did that. I have a message on my phone from her from a few weeks before she passed. I didn't call her back. I don't know if I'll forgive myself for that. I was too busy, too distracted, too tired, yada, yada, yada. So I like to think that right there in that last voicemail, she had something to teach me that was very powerful. And that is so like Nancy. I was never, ever sorry when I did call her back. I was always and only loved and supported by her. I will miss her love, her intelligence, her humor, her grit, her will, and her beauty more than I can say. All I can say is thank you, Nancy, and I love you.
Sorry. We're very pleased now to welcome Greg Milne, Nancy's former colleague at the United Nations Office of the Special Envoy for Haiti, where we all worked. A number of people here from the UN office are here today. And Greg currently serves as the Chief Impact and Foreign Policy Officer at the Clinton Foundation. And he's going to share a reflection and bring us a message today from President Clinton.
Thank you so much, Jenny. My heart goes out to all those who are gathered today to celebrate the life of Nancy Dorsinville. Nancy dedicated her life to helping others, and the wisdom, compassion, and commitment she brought to her work was both inspiring and infectious. Her tireless efforts in Haiti to widen the circle of opportunity, advance equality, and expand access to critical resources like healthcare helped countless people build better lives for themselves and their families. I will always be deeply grateful for her outstanding work as my senior policy advisor when I was UN Special Envoy to Haiti, and her support of the Clinton Foundation's recovery and rebuilding efforts after the devastating earthquake there. The best tribute we can pay to her is to continue her work and follow her example. My thoughts and prayers are with Nancy's family, friends, colleagues, and all those whose lives she touched. Bill Clinton. And just like to take a moment as well to share brief personal thoughts. As so many others have already said, Nancy's life was all about encouraging human dignity and, of course, ensuring that people's voices were always being heard. Nancy's way involved a lot of careful listening, and I will always remember her warmth and her care for everyone she encountered. The time that I think best highlights this was when I had the pleasure of traveling with Nancy from New York to Port-au-Prince. And I'll just never forget that from the time we arrived at JFK until we got to Zamni Beni later that day, I truly think Nancy knew everyone that we encountered. And she took the time to ask about themselves and their families and cared to listen to their stories and their challenges. And I'll just never forget the way that she just graced people and the way that she took that time, no matter what else was happening in her life. She was a truly amazing person, as you all know, and I will really miss her deeply.
Greg, thank you so much. Loune needs no introduction. And today, I think, Loune, can you hear us there?
Yes.
Yes, she is with Nicole Beni, who is one of Nancy's godchildren. And Loune and Nicole are going to share a letter. It's we have a picture of it here, and it's written in French, and so we'll read it in French, and then Loune will translate it for us.
Thank you, Jenny. Unfortunately, your video, the camera doesn't work, but jeudi 15 avril 2021, de Nicole à Mamie Nancy. Merci, Mamie Nancy, pour ton aide. Bien que tu es mort, que Dieu te protège pendant que tu es avec lui et que tu restes toujours avec Dieu et que tu es une des disciples de Dieu et que ton âme repose en paix. Je t'aime, Mamie Nancy, pour tout ce que tu as fait pour moi. On Monday, April 12th, we learned the sad news. Immediately, we organized a gathering, prayers and songs at Zamni Beni. Shared stories of Nancy and how she has impacted our lives. One of our kids, Nicole, who is an 11-year-old, was the most visually affected. The next morning, she decided that she would write a letter to her godmother, Nancy. My daughter, Maureen, who is watching us, was tasked to make sure that the letter reaches Nancy's coffin. And Maureen managed to do as instructed by Nicole. From Nicole to Mamie Nancy. Thank you, Mamie Nancy, for all your help. Even though you are now in heaven, may God protect you while you are with him, and may you always stay with God, and may you be one of God's disciples, and may your soul rest in peace. I love you, dear Mommy Nancy, for everything you have done for me. Todo, amar y servir. Thank you.
Loune, thank you so much. Our last speaker, and before our closing prayer, and we have a video to show, is someone, of course, who needs no introduction, Paul. And suffice to say that Nancy was family to Paul and Dee Dee and their three children, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Sebastian. And I think there's a lot of people who feel the same way about Nancy's ability to form deep and meaningful connections. And so I want to just thank all of our speakers for your beautiful, beautiful tributes. And I really want to just thank Ishan for helping so much with the technology, which has made a big difference in terms of us being able to gather. So, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you all for gathering. I know that, as Abby said, a memorial service can bring someone to life in new ways, and I'm feeling that already, and it's a very welcome sentiment. I think everybody here can feel the pain as well as the appreciation. I'd also like to thank Nancy's brother, Ralph Dorsinville, who's here with us and on short notice. And of course, we'll leave time for him if he'd like to speak. I just wanted to go back to what I said in opening this session, which is that there are many Nancys, and yet they all fit so beautifully into the one Nancy that we knew and loved. Sometimes we didn't want to get on the bad side of one of those Nancys, but mostly we just reveled in her ability to connect with people. Hearing Greg talk about a trip from JFK to Port-au-Prince, I know if I wasn't on that particular trip, that a lot of the talking began right at JFK, since Nancy knew everyone at American Airlines, just as she did people in the Port-au-Prince airport, and of course, all over that country, and as Kerry told us in other ones as well. I've known Nancy a very long time, as has Dee Dee and my children since they were born, but really got to know her well when living at one of the Harvard dorms. We had a 5-year-old girl, the same age as our Catherine, come up for cancer care, for surgery and radiotherapy and chemo. She was there a long time, months and months. And Nancy would come by, and she became friends with a young man from Miami, who is now the very same Jesuit, Father Emilio, who is mourning her loss with us. It's just like Nancy, of course, to keep her friendships together. Father Emilio was the person who was calling her on the phone when she didn't respond to calls and knew to send someone to look for her. That child, Mavleen, I'm happy to tell you, survived her cancer and is alive and well. And I just haven't had the strength really to tell her that Nancy is no longer with us. This kind of exercise helps us all to think about those activities, the sharing, the consolation we can offer each other in thinking about her example. I really also am grateful to Jim Kim, who along with Nancy was a Kellogg Fellow at some times and told me what a brilliant person she was, and I got to see that that is true. And in the years since, the decades since, we've been lucky enough to work together and been very grateful for that as well. In 2002, for example, Nancy helped to nominate Loune for the Robert F. Kennedy Prize, which is how we got to meet Kerry, Monica, and others on this call. Loune, of course, is a champion of social and economic rights, which were also a topic of special concern to Nancy. And so the years passed, all of us getting these lessons we needed, getting our children often getting the hilarious commentary of Nancy, who knew every way to say darling, sweetheart, etc., and didn't fail to do that on a regular basis. As was mentioned, she had a great sense of humor. And as Luke said, Nancy also had a fearlessness about expressing her own sorrow and grief at truly grievous things that were happening around her. And it has been noted also that she could be steely and determined when the circumstances called for it. The day after the earthquake, I can hardly even remember the date. I keep on confusing it. And I know other people who do that as well. I was back in Haiti, and Nancy and Loune met me at the airport. Less than a month earlier, Dee Dee and I had gone to the General Hospital to visit this so-called abandoned babies unit, which wasn't an abandoned babies unit at all. They were children, and some of them babies, who had been left at the General Hospital, not because their parents wanted to leave them behind, but just because they had been overwhelmed by the challenges of raising a handicapped child without any kind of support. And the reason Dee Dee and I went there was to make sure that they had square meals to eat. And so we launched in December, right before the earthquake, a program to strengthen the kitchen at the General Hospital, which is not a place where we work, but we had this concern with these children and wanted to get them out of there to a safe place. Less than 3 weeks later, the earthquake struck. And as I said, Loune and Nancy met us at the airport, which had also been shut down and was really functioning with the help of military services. And I just remember, first of all, looking at Nancy, who is a very fastidious person, always beautifully dressed. And she was just covered, as was Loune, with dust. And I didn't have to ask what it was from. The whole city was covered with dust. Loune and Nancy said, well, we're going to back to the General Hospital, which is where I was headed anyway, to try and attend to the wounded. But they were going to check on the children that Bill and many others have mentioned already. And I realized just then that I'd forgotten about them completely. That, Abby, is a lot worse than not returning a call. I was a champion of not returning Nancy's calls and then calling her back and talking for long, long periods. But I had forgotten about these kids, and that's something that Nancy and Loune would never do, even for a few nerve-wracking hours, as we were waiting to find out what happened to family, friends, and coworkers. No one knew at that time, and no one knew the next day or the day after. This terrible news crept out day after day when someone who was missing was discovered to be dead, or maybe on those wonderful occasions where someone was pulled out of the rubble alive. Nancy and Loune, again, I want to say that Nancy was a rock during those terrible days. She rallied, not just to those children and to Loune, but to all of us, and got us through some very difficult times, and taught us lessons again. And you've heard these lessons, I don't need to repeat them here, but this was Nancy at her best. And so too with Zami Beni. Zami Beni is, as Bill explained, those are the same kids in this abandoned baby unit. And of course now a lot more others, because there were more than 47 children in harm's way. The miracle, and I do believe that it's a miracle that Nancy prayed for, and I know that she wouldn't like us calling her a saint, but the fact that all 47 of those children were alive and unharmed, to me, was stunning, since much of the hospital had collapsed around them. And that was not the fate of many of the patients and many of the nurses and doctors. And next door in the National Nursing School, very few members of the third-year class survived, and neither did their teachers. And in the middle of these very dark times, Loune, and I'm sorry, Loune, to keep underlining your pivotal role, but you were a source of great strength to Nancy, as you are to so many of us. Loune and Nancy rallied, and with Bill and many others, pulled together what is, to this day, an oasis that bears her mark, a beautiful, healing place, and aptly named. I'm not ready to think about these last few weeks and months and, you know, how much we miss Nancy and how much we miss her now. But I am ready to say that there is a deep grace for all of us in reflecting on her life and her accompaniment. I think the accompaniment that she provided to so many, again, from so many walks of life, is going to live on. And I hope, as Father Jorge and Ali said, that we get to join her and see her again. But before we part ways, we have a little, I say we as if I made it, there is a little video that we'd like to show, and so that we can smile at seeing her beautiful image. Abby?
You dwell in the shelter of the Lord, who abide in his shadow for life. Say to the Lord, my refuge, my rock, in whom I trust, and he will raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you to shine like the sun, and hold you in the palm of his hand. The snare of the fowler will never capture you, and famine will bring you no fear. Under his wings, your refuge, his faithfulness, your shield, and he will raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you to shine like the sun, and hold you in the palm of his hand. And for to his angels he's given a command to guide you in all of your ways. Upon their hands they will bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. And he will raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you to shine like the sun, and hold you in the.
Before we go our separate ways, let us take leave of our sister Nancy. May our farewell express our affection for her. May it ease the sadness of those who loved her and strengthen their hope. One day, we shall joyfully greet her again when God's love, which conquers all things, destroys even death itself. I share with you the prayer of commendation from the rite of Christian burial in the Roman Missal. Let us pray. Into your hands, Father of mercies, we commend our sister Nancy in the sure and certain hope that together with all who have died in Christ, she will rise with him on the last day. We give you thanks for the blessings which you bestowed upon Nancy in this life. They are signs to us of your goodness and of our fellowship with the saints in Christ. Merciful Lord, turn toward us and listen to our prayers. Open the gates of paradise to your servant and help us who remain to comfort one another with assurances of faith until we all meet in Christ and are with you, with our sister forever. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. This concludes our memorial service, but the Zoom connection will remain open for those who wish to chat with friends. Grant her, O Lord, eternal rest, and let perpetual light shine upon her. And may her soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Go in peace.